I'm going to start with Jesus just because, well, I'll tell you why in a second. But in Matthew 7, verse 15, this is the clearest statement of what I want to say this morning. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but every bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. And we're going to come back to that because that's really an interesting statement to me, because I've heard good sermons from bad people. We'll come back to it. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire, and thus by their fruit you will recognize them. So Jesus, using the tree, sets up this connection between roots and fruit. And that is the connection between, and our roots are our character, right? That's the essence of who we are, is our character. And part of our character is our belief system. And then that moves naturally into how we live, or specifically in this context, how we preach. So preaching is just one among many different activities. And so Jesus right up front says there is a connection. Now, the reason that I'm emphasizing that is that the connection is just as strong in the pastorals. In fact, it's so strong that people use it as an argument that Paul could not have written the pastorals. Paul would never critique someone's character. He would only critique their theology. And the fact that there's not that much theological correction going on in the pastorals, but that the emphasis on look at how they live, look at how bad of people they are, that tells you that what they're teaching is wrong. And a group of commentators just argued that Paul would never do that. But all that Paul is doing is following Jesus' lead, and that there is a connection between root and fruits, between character and behavior, in our case specifically character and preaching. Poor character results in heretical teaching and ungodly behavior. And then to flip it, ungodly behavior proves their theology is wrong. Now, again, I've already mentioned that sometimes I scratch my head because I have heard good sermons from bad people. And we're going to come back to that. But as a basic rule, that's what's being set up. So flip over to Titus. I'm going to start with Titus. And by the way, I was reading Frank Thielman's book on the way here. I figured since I'm coming to Beeson, I should read what Beeson people say. Have you guys got this one? This is, boy, he did a good job on the pastorals. I mean, he laid out a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you, and we're going to be talking about. So, very, very good book. Happens to be published by Zondervan. But in Titus 1, and actually I had never noticed it, that's why I mentioned it, and Frank makes a big deal of it. Titus starts, Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. There's your connection. That it's your, again, I'm combining character, I'm combining theology as part of a person's character, but it's the knowledge of the truth that has an indissoluble link to behavior, to godliness. And then to state it in reverse, go to Titus 1:16. And now he's talking about the false teachers, and he says, they claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. They're detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good. So there's the same connection made in reverse, isn't it? It said, if you truly know the truth, then that will of necessity lead toward godliness. The reverse of it is that if your actions deny then that tells you something about the person's character. You guys know the Bible Project? It's out of Portland. It's an incredible ministry. All supported by Francis Chan, I found out. Francis Chan's Ministries is paying for what we try to hire someone to work on biblical training, and the Bible Project got her. That's why I know this. They have 30 people working, and Francis Chan's Ministries are paying for the entire thing. So kudos for Francis Chan. But they have their videos they do, but they have a really good podcast. And I'm having a senior moment because I just completely forgot why I'm even talking about the podcast. Just a second. I'm 66, and these are occurring more frequently than I would like to admit. Something on the podcast, the connection. Okay, it'll come to me someday. All right. So that was just to set the stage, that there is this connection between character and preaching and behavior. Well, I'll give you an example. This happened in Vancouver. It's all in the newspaper. There is a very large church, so big it took over a part of a shopping mall, and had a great reputation, and powerful evangelistic preacher. And we actually went to it once, and it was a positive experience. Turns out that there was a ministry the church was supporting with quite a bit of money down the Mexican coast. And they found out that it wasn't a ministry, that it was the pastor's vacation home. And his son was a heroin addict. And the reason they had the home down there is that it was easier for them to buy heroin to support his son's drug habit. They found out about it, and the church responded properly, but apparently he had brought heroin back, through the border, which is you can't do. And so there was a court case. And they thought he was just going to get slapped on the wrist. He was a poor, misguided man trying to care for his 20-year-old son that was having trouble. It was spun that way. On the day of sentencing, the feds walked in. And it turns out that the pastor was part of the drug cartel, smuggling massive amounts of heroin into Vancouver area from his ministry home in Mexico. Now, would you ever dream of doing that? I mean, in your Stephen King novel part of your mind, does that even occur to write that kind of story? This is the issue that I'm trying to talk about this morning, is that how can a person with that kind of character think that that's okay when he's doing something totally different? And when he's doing something totally different, the fruit shows what he really is. Maybe this is a good time to tell some stories. I don't know what goes on in Beeson. I really hope this is not true of Beeson. I would be naive to think that it's not present in some shape or form. But the numbers are about 50% of seminarians, male seminarians, are porn addicts. Are you aware of that? Porn is a massive problem on most campuses. When I first went to Gordon Conwell, I preached a sermon. New professors preached for 3 chapels in a row. And my first service was just, and I'm not picking on Gordon Conwell, it's first-hand knowledge for me there, but I've been told by professors in other seminaries that it's just as big a problem other places. And I preached a sermon on how much sin are you going to allow in your life. We all make a choice, right? None of us are monks living out in the desert. And we all allow some. We go to movies or we don't go to movies. we go to PG or PG-13 or R, right? I mean, if you're going to live in this world, you will have to make a decision that I have to endure some amount of cultural sin. I have to allow some kind of influence in my life. Otherwise, I can't live and I can't minister in the world. So that's all I said. I said, I just want to challenge you to be deliberate about it. That was a sermon. Not a normal sermon for me, but the next morning, I was at work pretty early for some reason, and 3 students showed up at my office, and they said, do you know what's going on in the dorms? I went, no. She said, a revival broke out last night. I went, what? There was mass confessions of pornographic addiction, cutting of illegal connections to internet, burning of books and burning of magazines on a really good seminary campus. And she said, you need to come down to see it because it's still going on. Unfortunately, I got a call from an administrator who was not happy that I had not preached verse by verse through some passage, and told me that was not an acceptable way to preach. And I hadn't been there long enough to invite him down to the dorms. But it was, all I said was, how much sin are you going to let in your life? And God's Spirit moved because people started to understand that their character matters. Now, again, I am not picking on Gordon Conwell. I've talked to a lot of professors in a lot of different seminaries, and they go, yeah. I have personal stories of friends that were students of mine at Gordon Conwell who moved into pulpit ministry and then had affairs. And the process is something like this. I can't please my church no matter what I do. They're always wanting me to do something different. I'm neglecting my wife and my kids because I have to go to all these stupid meetings and mow the lawn. And I am completely out of control of my life. My marriage is suffering. Well, there's something I can't control. And they turn to porn. And then porn then moves into affairs. My wife is a life coach. And she would like to start a business, but the problem is none of her clients can afford anything. Because the Lord is sending her, wife after wife whose husbands were pastors and were caught in affairs and got fired, which means they have no money to pay Robin to start her business. There's no end to her business because there is so many problems of character that result in behavior that's so ungodly that the church won't put up with it. I'm sure you know stories. I'm sure you know stories of one of the problems I had trouble in my church was that I wouldn't go to evening meetings, and the elders were very unhappy with me. And I said, look, I have 3 teenagers at home. If you think I'm going to leave my 3 teenagers to sit through one of your deacons' meetings, then I am not the right person for this church. My kids will always come before this church. The poor guy who replaced me at the church, they put his personal cell phone number on the glass door so he could be called 24 hours a day. I hope your church doesn't have glass doors. You see, this is the problem that is so concerning to me, and it's why we're building leadership curriculum. And it's why I have so many misgivings about traditional seminary education. Now again, you all have this phenomenal advantage of a 1-to-7 teacher ratio here. I think that's what it is at Beeson, isn't it? 1-to-7. So I heard about one class that was overwhelmed with numbers. There were 15 people in it. My New Testament survey was 120 people. That's normal what it is. I taught the pastorals at Southern once, and I had 130, 140 people. You have advantages to get to know your professors and have relationships with them that most people don't even dream of. So I really hope you're taking advantage of Mr. Beeson's grant to this school that provided this kind of education for you. But if you don't know the stories, you will, unfortunately, get to know the stories of people who buckle under what I would just say ungodly ecclesiology. where they don't understand their role in the church doesn't understand the role of the staff in the church, and it creates pressure, and that's where character is formed. And so my hope is that you never separate out who you are as a person and what you believe, and then how you behave, specifically how you preach. Okay, that's the connection that I want to talk about. One of the churches that we attended when I taught in Southern California, the pastor he was a really good exegete. He was dispensational. I'm not dispensational, so we differed on stuff, but I still really appreciated the work that he did, and his ability to preach is very well known in the area. And turns out he was molesting his counselees. And one of our best friends was his administrative assistant, and it destroyed her when they announced that he had been fired because of sexual misconduct. She had a radical breakdown in the church. They had to pick her up and carry her out because she idolized this guy so much. But he was not a good person. He thought that there wasn't a connection between character and preaching. What I want to do is go through 3 or 4, depending upon how time goes, 3 or 4 steps. I want to talk theologically at first about the connection of who we are and how we behave, and a problem I think that is paramount in our church. And then we'll look at the opponents, the false teachers, and we'll see it illustrated. And then we'll flip it over and get very positive and look at the elders, because the requirements for elders and the pastorals are a flip side of the false teachers. The false teachers were drunkards, so the requirement in all 3 lists in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 is that a church leader cannot be addicted to wine. And so what you'll find is that you can see the negative example in the false teachers, and then you flip it over and you get a positive. And that's actually where I want to spend more time. On the requirements for elders. And then I really want to get into some of the more practical aspects of how do you develop character, especially in students and in staff in your church. So that's kind of where we're headed. Okay. So let's start with number 1, the theological affirmations of the connection between character and behavior. And stated theologically, this is the connection between justification and sanctification. And you all aren't students, but especially when I'm speaking to seminaries, I say this is one of the most fundamental decisions that you have to make, is what is the relationship between justification and sanctification? Because justification is moving into a relationship with God. Sanctification is living in a relationship with God. And what is the connection between the two of them? And they're certainly different, right? I'm not blending those two. But the argument from the pastorals is that they were never meant to be, they're 2 sides of the same coin in a very real sense. The pastorals joined justification and sanctification so closely that one is who you are, your position, positional sanctification, your justification. And then the other is how you live, your experiential sanctification. And the pastorals, I think more than any other book of the Bible, pulls those 2 things so closely together that they do not allow you to separate a person's character from a person's behavior. Now, I am, just so you know, I'm mildly reformed. Like Gary Brashear says, I'm a bad Calvinist. I think I'm closer to Calvin than a lot of Calvinists, but just so you know where I'm coming from. And I understand that there are firm differences, and especially there's times in the history of the church where we have to keep them separate, right? That we have to insist that justification is by faith and faith alone, and that it is a work of God in which we do not cooperate. We merely respond to his work in our life. Sanctification is the process of cooperation with God through the power of the Spirit, where we have to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, right? So don't misunderstand me. I'm not Arminian. I don't think these things are all wrapped in the same way. But the pastorals puts them so closely. My mom and I always had grammatical arguments, and she usually won because sooner or later I would drop the ly in an adverb. I think of it. Mom passed away several years ago, but to the end of her life, we were still correcting each other's grammar. Anyway, closely. They're so closely, there you go, Mom, related that it's unnatural to separate them. I just finished a book. My editor doesn't like it, so I have more work to do on it. But it uses the imagery of the path and the gate. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And the gate is conversion. The gate is justification. And the path is discipleship. It's sanctification. And so the book, it's a layman's book. It's 12 hikes in the Pacific Northwest and what you learn about God in each of the hikes. So it's a semi-allegory kind of book. I think one of, if not the major problem in the American church is that we have come to view the gate as necessary and the path as optional. All right? So all that you have to do is get your get out of hell free card, as one of my parishioners used to say. And nothing else mattered. My uncle used to say, I'm going to take a front seat in heaven, a front seat on earth and a back seat in heaven. And I always wanted to say to Uncle George, there are no back seats in heaven. That if you're shooting for that goal, you're going to miss it. And it's this idea that if I've raised my hand, if I said the sinner's prayer, if I shed a tear, as important as those things are, that's all that I really have to do. And, this whole grace theology, which is not biblical grace, I don't believe, where it just says nothing else matters, I think it's completely wrong. And it's saying the path it's completely optional. And if you want more rewards in heaven, then, go be a good Christian. But it doesn't really matter, right? You're all familiar with this, right? And I'm assuming at Beeson that's not something taught here. Okay. He smiled at me, and I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, it is. There's no way that's being taught at Beeson. It's okay. Otherwise, I need to have dinner with Paul tonight. So anyway, let's look at a couple of verses. 2 Timothy 2:19. This is the conclusion of a discussion where Paul is just telling Timothy to be really careful with the false teachers, stay away from them. And then basically, Timothy is having to deal with the problems of an established church. Paul spent more time in Ephesus than any place that we know of. And the church is more developed in Ephesus, and therefore the problems that they're having are unique compared to Paul's other churches. And it's really, really bad. And so Paul sends I believe his best friend, his most trusted associate, Timothy. By the way, this myth about Timothy being timid, tied in 2 Timothy says God did not give us a spirit of timidity. The Greek word cannot mean timid. It's simply outside of the semantic range of the word. The word only means cowardice. And the ESV got it right, as I recall. And it's just a literary foil. Timothy was, I don't know what word to use to describe him. He was the guy that Paul sent into the worst of the situations. He was the one that he showed the most affection for. So Timothy is not this frail weak little guy who needs to drink wine and not just water to get through the day. Timothy was, I want to say a man. I don't think there's a word in the English language yet to describe it. He was not this timid little frail guy. The problems in Ephesus were massive. And all I do is read the descriptions of what's going on, and you see, what a mess. It's the kind of church that a denomination would come in and shut down because it was unsolvable. Anyway, so Timothy is in this mess. And what Paul wants to do in verse 19 is saying, but now don't forget God's still on his throne. Okay, despite the apparent success of Satan in the case of Ephesus, God still has his. And so he says, nevertheless, despite all the mess, Timothy, you're having to deal with, God's solid foundation stands firm and sealed with this inscription. So think of a dual inscription on the foundation of a building, something that's been etched into the concrete or into the brick. And there's two statements. The Lord knows those who are his. Okay, that's one of the strongest statements of election I think there is. God knows who his children are. Despite all the problems, there are his children present, and he knows exactly who they are. And everyone who confesses the name of the Lord must turn away from wickedness. Well, wait a minute, Paul, what'd you just do? I took conversion, justification, election, that whole bundle, the gate, and said, despite the apparent success of Satan in the Ephesian church, and it says in 1 Timothy 4, this is demonic, and what's going on is demonic. The Lord still has his, and they are secure in his hands. And at the very same time, he says, depart from wickedness. See what he's doing? He's putting the gate and the path right next to each other. And we know that they're theologically different, but yet you can't separate them. I don't think. You know, the interesting thing is that I taught at Azusa Pacific University in Southern Cal for 10 years. And it's a Wesleyan school. And they hired me, quote, as their token Calvinist, which I thought was interesting because I don't know of any Calvinistic or Reformed institutions that hire a token Wesleyan. Be a good thing. It's a good thing. We had lots of interesting discussions arguing my different positions. But what I found is that Calvin and Wesley, not their followers, but Calvin and Wesley are really not that different. You know, the timing of regeneration, how they talk about election. I mean, yeah, there are some differences. But Calvin was just as strong as Wesley was, is that the faith that saves is faith alone, but the faith that saves is never alone. I don't think Calvin said that, but that's what he wrote in his Institutes. And Wesley never believed in works righteousness, but his emphasis was on the necessity of the path, the necessity of living out your Christian commitment. So when I draw a timeline, I put the cross in the middle, I put Calvin on one side, Wesley on another, and I put Calvinists over here and Wesleyans and Arminians over here. But Calvin and Wesley really agreed with this statement that these two propositions need to be held in tension with each other. In our context, as a way to say your character, who you are as a person, matters. How you behave. Look down at, well, I've already looked at, look at 2 Timothy 1:9. My eyes are going. Verse 9, he has saved us, and called us to a holy life. Not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace, and so forth and so on. See, right close together. Look at Titus 2, starting at verse 11. Very, very important passage. Affirmation of the divinity of Christ is stronger here than anywhere else in the New Testament. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions. So God's grace not only saves us, but it teaches us, it empowers us to live a certain kind of life, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, while I wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. There's your strongest affirmation in Scripture of the divinity of Christ. In fact, the Greek is so clear that it has to be saying that God and Savior are the same person, and that person is Jesus Christ. I mean, there's simply no way to get around the Greek, which is used as an argument by some people that Paul could never have written this, because Paul obviously didn't believe that Jesus was God, right? That's a later fabrication of the church. My tongue's in my cheek. You know that. But it's stated right there. The grace of God has appeared that offers salvation, and that very same grace teaches us to say no to ungodliness. Look at Titus 3. And it starts at verse 3. We once were really lousy people. We're hating one another. Verse 4. But when the kindness and love of God our Savior appeared, he saved us. Not because of righteous things we have done, but because of his mercy. He saved us through the washing of rebirth. My doctoral dissertation was on that word, so I have to pause because no one's ever going to read the dissertation. It's some library in Aberdeen. Anyway, he saved us through the washing of rebirth and the renewal of the Holy Spirit, whom he poured out on us generously through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that, having been justified by his grace, we might become heirs, having the hope of eternal life. So what you do is, I probably should have skipped verses 3 and 4, but we were once this kind of person, and God's grace appeared that not only regenerated us, but it renewed us, so it would be a different kind of person, is the thrust of what he's saying. All that I'm trying to say, and you know, you may be in total agreement with this, so I may be preaching to the choir, but this is the message of the pastorals, that there is an indissoluble link between justification and sanctification. And I think a large part of the sickness in the American church is because we have separated those two things. You know, and the whole thing about the new view of Paul and stuff, one of the good things that did come out of it, I think, is that it helped us understand that the Jews have markers. And in Judaism, salvation was about this marker called circumcision, and this marker called, if you weren't born Jew, then being baptized as a proselyte. And there's, observing of the Sabbath. There were certain things they checked off, right? And that's what constituted being a good Jewish person, however you want to say it. Catholic Church, right? Same thing, right? You have your 7 rites, and you can check them off. Baptists have the same mentality, don't they? Now, we have different things that we use. They look different, but it's still a checking off. Well, I go to church on Sunday once a month. And I don't kick my dog, and I'm better than my neighbor. But it's this sickness that views a relationship with God through Jesus Christ as a series of check boxes, and that's all there is. I dated a girl, did not marry her. It's not Robin, but I dated a girl in Bowling Green once then. Her father was a deacon in the church and all this kind of stuff. And I got to know him pretty well just because it was a semi-serious relationship. And, to the point I used to go out and cut tobacco with him, which, if you cut tobacco with someone, that means you're a pretty good friend. Have you ever cut tobacco? Really? None of you have cut tobacco? Oh, my goodness. Don't ever do it. Oh, tobacco is just the most miserable thing. It's sticky and dirty. And the worst thing is when you put like 8 or 9 stalks of tobacco on these sticks, and then you go in these multi-level barns, and you have to straddle them, and you hand them, and then all the junk comes down on you. I mean, you simply can't get clean. Anyway, you get to know people when you cut tobacco, is the point. And I'll never forget a time where an African American was invited over to their house with a whole bunch of other church people, and he went over there and he was so good, blah 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 blah, and came over to where I and some of the guys were sitting, and just what he said was unrepeatable. See, who he was had no correlation to what he really thought, how he really behaved. I'd never met a bigot like this before. And that illustration was just to make that point, that he thought he could serve as the deacon in the church and run the church and be the big man on the church, and yet his character was appalling. It was absolutely horrific. So I'm just using examples to try to kick them loose in your head. Yeah, I've used most of these illustrations already. If I say grace is transformative, how does that hit you? I know there's a debate on this point, and I don't know where Dr. Thielman is on it. I like to think of grace as being transformative. We're saved by grace, totally by God's grace. We don't participate. We're not part of the process. And yet, that grace is going to change us. And the problem that we have is that people don't see that. And so they think they can become any kind of person that they choose to be. And it doesn't affect their performance, their preaching, their behavior. And I'm saying the same thing. I'm just trying to say it a lot of different ways. If you experience mercy, you will show mercy. Not perfectly, not all the time, maybe not right away. But I don't believe it's possible to experience mercy and not in some imperfect way express mercy. So what do you guys taught? This is actually relevant. What do you guys taught about nominative personal pronouns, what the emphasis is in Greek? Do you remember this problem? You can say baptizo, or you can say ego baptizo. Well, the ego, right? It's repetitive. It's unnecessary. You get the person. You get the subject out of the verb. Baptizo means I baptize. Ego baptizo means I baptize. But you especially get this with autos, right? Remember this? That if you say autos baptize, he baptizes, or she baptizes, or it baptizes. What is the role of that nominative pronoun, autos? I got to get to Greek sooner or later, right? I mean, you would be disappointed if I didn't some of this. Look at, let's flip it. We got time to do this. Go to the Beatitudes in Matthew for a second, if you would. Are any of you familiar with the problem in the Beatitudes and the pronouns? Have you come across that? Okay. It's an issue of nuance, and the presence of the nominative pronouns will never. How many people have learned Greek? Let me make sure. I'm assuming most of you have had some exposure. Yeah. Okay. All right. The problem is that the structure in all of these is the same in that. Look at, let's say, look at verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. You can get the they out of the verb inherit, but it's also altoi. It's there. What's it doing there? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for altoi will be filled. Are they? I saw you looking it up. Are they plural or singular? They're plural, aren't they? I'm trusting my memory. Okay, that's never good. Blessed are the merciful, for altoi will be shown mercy. And because that is repeated every single time, you got to ask yourself, what's it doing there? Because it's an unnecessary word. Well, I've gotten to the position in grammar where when you have a pronoun in the singular that's not like clarifying gender or something like that, that it is adding some kind of emphasis. Sometimes it's an emphasis by contrast. I baptize you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit is the classic example. But sometimes it's just hitting it a little harder. And there's no way to translate that. If I were to over-translate, I would say, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown merciful. In other words, they and they alone will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they and they alone will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, because only peacemakers are going to be called children of God. Blessed are those who mourn, because only the mourners are going to be comforted. Now, that's over translation, but that's what it's getting at. So when I say grace is transformative, this is what I mean. People who have experienced God's work in their life, it changes them. It must of necessity change them. How much? Not the judge. That's not my job. But I know that in my life, God's grace has to be transformative. And I have good days and bad days, good years and bad years, good decades and bad decades. But I understand that over the course of my life, there's a trajectory where if I have experienced God's grace, it's going to change me. And if I want to be blessed because I've experienced God's mercy, I will be shown mercy, and in fact, I will become merciful. You see the connection I'm trying to make? I really think that the Altoy is making that point. Blessed are the merciful, because they and they alone. Well, work that back. How does that work? Well, it works that I have experienced God's mercy, and that's going to change me such that I will become a mercy giver. I don't think there's any other way to read the Bible and to understand that connection. Does that make sense? That I kind of circuitous to get there, but okay. If you experience mercy, you will eventually, in some, most likely imperfect ways, show mercy. The preacher is the person whose character has been fundamentally changed, got a new heart, right? And that new heart will, of necessity, show itself in behavior. Any comments or questions on the connection between character and behavior, character and preaching? Yes, sir.
You used the word trajectory, and I think it was about a year ago, a couple of guys were on our staff read a book together. And the thought of the book was, a lot of Christians are set up to think that, you have this graph where you have dips and rises, but slowly you become more and more like Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the book kind of made the point, no, that's not the case at all, and that's why Christians are always so disappointed, either when they fail or they see other people fail. We need to see it more as a flat line. All of us need grace, but it's not a trajectory where we get better and better.
Yeah.
Push back on that.
Yeah, I would push back on that pretty hard.
And so there was a big debate, though, about the disappointment that when we don't see the trajectory happen in our lives or the lives of our
Yeah. Well, there's 3 tests for assurance of salvation in 1 John, and one of them is a changed life. And I think a changed life is pretty important. The fruits of the Spirit are in ever-increasing measure. And the problem in Romans 6 is that people got their get-out-of-hell-free card and thought that, to use your word, you just flatlined from that point on. Nothing mattered. That growth wasn't important. The reason I use the word trajectory, and I know it has some negative connotations in other contexts, but my concern is that people not think they have to be perfect, especially leaders don't have to be perfect. And 3 steps forward, sometimes 4 steps back. This is the nature of the Christian life. But I think that if our lives are not in ever-increasing measure conforming to the image of Christ, 2 Corinthians, if we are not in, albeit imperfect, but in some way showing the fruits of the Spirit, then we have another problem. If you don't have the fruits of the Spirit, then the question is, do you have the Spirit? So I have never heard anyone argue that point. So I'm not quite sure how to respond. But in my life, if I were content with where I was, I would really worry. Because I think we are, to an ever-increasing measure, grown to the likeness of Christ. I think that's, you look at the loop in Colossians, that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will, so that you can, I forget the exact words, but the idea is you can grow, and as you grow, you learn more, and there's this ever-increasing process that Paul prays for the Colossian church. You shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Yeah, it's an unreachable goal, but it's still what we strive for. Jesus didn't say, you shall be minimal as your Father. Yeah, I mean, it's just...
I am fascinated by this conversation relationship to Jamie Smith's habits forming character, shaping character, and so I'm interested if you see the pastorals or any part of the Bible really kind of affirming that emphasis that behavior is going to form character, so that there's this cyclical relationship, new heart, new behavior, but yet behavior is going to continue to somehow reshape the heart. I could be misunderstanding that emphasis, but I'm fascinated by that. Whether or not, I mean, I think he takes it from Augustine, but
Okay. I'm thinking of Paul's admonitions to Timothy, and I'm wondering if there's cycles in there. Let me think about that. It's certainly true. I mean, it's the way God built us is all this stuff is tied together, and character and habits are all intimately tied together. And one way to develop character is to have the right kind of habits, and vice versa too. That as your character grows into Christ's likeness, it will show itself in repeated actions. So I'm sure the concept is accurate, but I'd have to think about. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get into the false teachers. So, okay, that's the theological basis. When you get to the actual false teachers, here's the problem in the pastorals. Excuse me. If you go to any other Paul's writings, boy, I just moved out of one set of allergies in the Northwest and got introduced to your kind of pine pollen, and I made the mistake of opening my window last night. Yeah, should have left something. Should have left them shut. Anyway. I forgot how we introduced this. Oh, yeah. When you look at any other Paul's letters, and he wants to say why something is wrong, he says this is why it's wrong. It's a violation of this teaching. It contradicts creation. It's just Paul has very theological arguments, right, as to people who are, 2 Thessalonians, they're saying the day of the Lord's already come. No, because this has to happen and this has to happen, and when it happens, everyone's going to see it. So I mean, it's theological refutation. That happens a little in the pastorals. It's in 1 Timothy 1 and 1 Timothy 4 and a few other places. But the bulk of Paul's discussion of the false teaching is basically look at their character. Well, it's more look at how they behave. I'm sorry, I said it backwards. Look at how they behave. Good people don't behave this way. Bad people behave this way. And in fact, their behavior shows that not only do they lack Christian character, but they are in fact evil people. I mean, he draws some very, very strong conclusions about their character based on their behavior. And if it weren't Paul doing it, I would be nervous to do that. I think we have to allow apostles certain rights that us non-apostles don't have. But Paul is willing to move from their behavior to saying, look at the fruit, it's bad. Oh yeah, Jesus did that too, didn't he? Yeah. The fruit's bad, therefore the tree's bad. And that's what's going on in the pastorals. And again, it's one of the arguments that people say why Paul didn't write the pastorals was because Paul doesn't do this. Well, Jesus does it, and Paul does do it elsewhere. So I think we're on safe ground. The main point, though, that I want to say is the pastorals show an indissoluble link between a person's character and a person's behavior. All right. So let me introduce this, and then maybe we'll take a break and go get some more coffee or something. Come back. And by the way, Frank's, do you guys refer to your teachers here by first name, or are you all more formal? Depends upon the teacher. Okay. A little more, you have more on the formal side. So I'm assuming Thielman would be a Professor Thielman or Dr. Thielman. You don't know Paul House's nickname? No, I can't tell you. He does a really good job at describing this. In fact, he has a couple of pages where this is the point he's actually making, that bad conduct tells you something about the person's character. So if you want a lot more verses, read Dr. Thielman's book. Or he's actually on biblical training. If you go into the Institute, you can, in the elective section, you can read his, listen to him. It actually, Beeson's been really generous with biblical training. I think they gave us 5 or 6 classes, Gerald Bray's church history, Timothy George's theology of the reformers. There are several other classes from Beeson that are on biblical training, which we're thankful for. Let me just read some of these descriptions. This is my commentary. Paul characterizes the opponent's teaching as unholy chatter, endless, foolish, senseless babble, sickly craving for speculations and empty words, deceived and deceiving, utterly lacking in love. It has the appearance of godliness and wisdom, but it has no power or wisdom. It promotes foolish and uneducated speculation rather than God's stewardship. They're fighting about empty words, harmful and useless quarrels, strife, envy. It is eating away at gangrene. They are foolish, understanding nothing, having a sickly craving for speculations and empty words. Now, you don't get that anywhere else in Paul. And by the way, speaking of under-translating, I really think Luke was Paul's amanuensis. I think that's why the vocabulary is a little different. And one of the reasons I think it was Luke was because we're told that Luke was with Paul at this time. But there's medical imagery all the way through the pastorals. And I couldn't get the ESV to translate the medical imagery. I'm still working on the NIV. But when it talks about, you get it a bit with a sickly craving. It talks about the false teachers are like sheep with open abrasions, rubbing up against each other, passing disease from one to the other, and the disease eating their bodies away like gangrene. The gangrene does get into the translations. There's these medical images all the way through the pastorals that don't exist anywhere else. And so that's one of the reasons I think the Dr. Luke was the amanuensis. But these are very, very strong descriptions. And the important thing is that Paul is critiquing their behavior and drawing conclusions about their character. And part of the answer as to why, I think, is how do you theologically refute senseless babble? I mean, I know there were times when I was pastoring and I'd be talking to someone and they were telling me what they believed about something. It was kind of like, could you say that again? I can't get my head around what you're saying. And it just was like, it just didn't make sense. I couldn't put pieces together. It wasn't coherent in any shape, way, or form. You've had these discussions. The first time I had it was with preterists. You guys had to deal with preterism yet? Yeah, it was. We had 3 of them that snuck into our church, just like Acts says is the pattern. Preterism is the belief that Jesus has already returned, and that there is no future hope. Okay, there's no eschaton. There's no final coming, and it's part of what created Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventism. The belief that Jesus did return. But preterism teaches that Jesus returned in AD 70. It was secret and nobody knew about it. Anyway, it was Gnostic is what it was. It was this consuming kind of, and it permeated everything they said and everything they did. But when you sit and you try to actually talk to them about it, and I'm sure there are preterists that have done a better job at being able to explain theologically why they believe Jesus already came back again. But in the ones I had to deal with, it was all just gobbledygook. That's a good word, isn't it? I haven't used that in a while. Gobbledygook. Is that a northern expression? Do you use it down here? Have you ever heard of the word gobbledygook? Okay, good. Universal. I think the major reason that Paul does what he does in the pastorals is because the false teachers, it was gobbledygook. It was senseless babble. How do you theologically refute something that doesn't make any sense? So I think that's why Paul had to, well, let's go to the next most obvious thing. I know this isn't what I normally do, but just, man, look at their lives. Look at how they're living. I mean, they're preaching for money. They're sleeping with the widows. They're producing speculation. There's nothing of faith in what they're doing. And you can look at the results and draw conclusions about the character. You get it right up in 1 Timothy 1. Go back there. Let me just read it because most of the commentaries look at 1 Timothy 1, 3 to 11 and 12 to 17 as parenthetical because verse 18 picks up right on verse 2. So they say those two intermediate chapters are parenthetical. And then they complain there's no theology in the pastorals. Well, this is all theology. So that's often what you do, right? If you want to argue position, you just remove the verses that argue against you and say, well, the Bible doesn't say it then. Anyway, welcome to the academy. As I urged you when I went to Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. Don't devote themselves. The same word is used of a drunk's devotion to liquor. It's a super strong emotional attachment. And what I have found with preterists and many other groups, that it's the only thing that matters. In fact, I had this one guy say, can you not teach a Sunday school class without bringing up preterism? And he goes, no. It was like asking a drunk, can you get through the day without touching liquor? The answer is no, I can't. That's these people. That's what they were doing. They were devoted themselves to myths, to endless genealogies. And again, Frank gives a really good description of historically how that fits into what's going on in proto-Gnosticism. Such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work. Rather, God's work is by faith. The goal of this command, in other words, Timothy, let's flip it over and not talk about how bad the opponents are. The goal of what I'm saying to you is love. This is to be who you are. This is your character. And love comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, a sincere faith. See, that's your character. That's who you are. And that is what is supposed to show itself in love and in a ministry based on faith. Some have departed from these. In other words, the false teachers were hypocrites. They abandoned a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And they've turned aside to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law. They want to be known as teachers. They want the reputation of being teachers. But they don't know what they're talking about or what they're so confidently affirming. And then he goes on and talks specifically about law and their misuse of the law. And then in verses 12 to 17, he gives his personal testimony that illustrates the fundamental point that the Christian life is about faith. It's not about this sick addiction to meaningless babble and made-up myths. He says, just look at my life. Look at how I was saved. Look at how I've lived. This is what's to characterize a Christian. So we've looked at the theological connection, the gate and the path, and we've started to look at the false teachers and how you can see that they still are, in fact, connected, can't you? Because their behavior and their preaching shows who they really are.